Hello everybody, I'm Anna Reading and I work at King's College, University of London, and I'm going to be giving this paper called Voiceless: How Memoirs by Autistic People Challenge Feminist Concepts and Methods Relating to Voice. On the right hand side of the image you'll see an image of a sculpture called Head with Wire by the autistic artist Benjamin Salmon. And I chose that because in many ways it sums up the complexities of voice that I've discovered within some of the autistic memoirs that I've been reading. My own background is in media studies, memory studies and gender studies, and I'm a long-time feminist activist. I'm a parent of 2 children, one of whom is autistic with complex needs, and I myself have CAD, which is a chronic autoimmune disorder which affects my neurology. So the context for the project is that it's a book project, and I'm looking at the ways in which autistic memoirs neuroqueer key concepts and methods in gender studies, media studies and memory studies, so working between the three. Some of the methods that I'm using, one method is a thematic reading of these autistic works, and I'm working with a neurodivergent researcher, and today's paper is very much focusing on the theme of voice that we've been looking at within autistic memoirs. So first of all then, what's meant by voice? Well, that's a complex issue and I don't think I can sum it up in one slide, but we might start by the dictionary definition and say that it's particular sounds produced from the larynx coming out through the mouth as speech or sound. We might also say, though, it's a particular opinion or attitude, point of view or experience expressed, and it's linked then to speech and language and our sense of hearing. Voice then also includes its linguistics, its metaphysics, its physics and its ethics, as Mladen Dolar writes in A Voice, Nothing More. Now, within medicalised autism studies, voice is pathologised in relation to autistic people against neurotypical norms, and it's very much framed in terms of lack or deficit. Autistic people are said to lack a voice, lack speech, and in that sense lack personhood. This is very much within a paradigm of otherness and within what is often seen as the puzzle of autism. We see the puzzle of delayed speech, the puzzle of apraxia, or the inability to speak, the selective mutism, an inability to use figures of speech, and the puzzle of echolalia, the ways in which phrases may be repeated back. Now, when autistic memoirs began to be published in increasingly high numbers from the 1980s onwards, we see then the development of psychological analyses of these autistic memoirs, in which they then looked at the differences as evidence of autistic difference from the norm. And if you want to read more on that, Melanie Yergau puts it so much better than I do in Authoring Autism. Voice is a key dimension, though, of memoirs by autistic people. You just need to look at some of these covers. So Carly's voice featured in the middle there is a #1 hit, for example, if you do a Google search of voice. And alongside that there's Naoki Higashida's Fall Down 7 Times, Get Up 8, a young man's voice from the silence of autism. And linked to this in many memoirs is the question then of speech and the question of the meaning of talk, as in Tito Mukhopadhyay's book How Can I Talk If My Lips Don't Move? Within feminist theory and methods, voice is featured very much in terms of questions of agency and power, a challenge to the silencing of women's voices, particularly historically and in terms of inequalities of power. On the left-hand side of this image, you'll see then a 17th century woodcut which depicts the silencing of a woman in a scold's bridle, used as a punishment for women who were said to speak too much. The aims then of much feminist theory and praxis has been about having a voice or giving voice. And by voice, says Rebecca Solnit, I don't mean only literal voice, the sound produced by the vocal cords in the ears of others, but the ability to speak up, to participate, to experience oneself and be experienced as a free person with rights. This includes the right not to speak. Feminist methods historically and today, then, we know have included story work and a lot of oral history work too, and the recording of women's voices and stories. Now, in terms then of voice, autism and gender, Melanie Yergo's Authoring Autism suggests that the denial of autistic voice is a denial of autistic personhood. She addresses the intersectionalities of marginality of race, gender and autism, and notes the lack of black voices served to make autism a white issue. She says in relation to rhetoric, I want a rhetoric that ticks, a rhetoric that stims, a rhetoric that faux pas, a rhetoric that averts eye contact, a rhetoric that lobs about theories of mind against the wall. Autistic memoirs, then, seem to provide a sense of inner voice, which does ally with feminist and intersectional approaches to voices expressing identity, and no more so than in people's accounts of abuse and sexual abuse. But how then is voice explained in autistic people's memoirs, and how does this go beyond feminist ideas of giving voice? I would suggest there's 3 ways that might be important to consider. The first is that voice is very much seen as something that is relational within autistic memoirs. In Carly Fleischmann's memoir, she recounts a particular dream she has, and the sequence of this is really interesting in terms of how voice is seen and understood and experienced by her in relation to her surroundings. A man, she says, in the front row gives me a weird look, and I turn away from his gaze and begin paying attention to the voice. The voice is announcing me as Carly Fleischmann, an autistic girl who found her voice by using a computer to communicate. The voice of the announcer goes on to say, I will be talking about autism and ways to cure it. A little further on, she says, I start to scream and notice something strange. I have control of my voice. I look out in the crowd and try to say a word. At this point, my view changes and I can see myself. In this sequence, her voice is not fixed but called into existence by her surroundings and by others, and at the moment she is able to control it, i.e. neurotypically, it is not that she voices herself, but she sees herself. This is important. The voice in many other memoirs go beyond the human in terms of their relationality. So Amanda Baggs in My Language, in her YouTube video, says, the first part of the video was in my native language. When I talk about this being in my language, people assume this means that each part of the video must have a particular symbolic message within it, designed for the human mind to interpret. But my language is not about designing words, or even visual symbols for people to interpret. It is about being in a constant conversation with every aspect of my environment, reacting physically to all aspects of my surroundings. In this part of the video, the water doesn't symbolise anything. I am just interacting with the water as the water interacts with me. So conventionally then, voice might be about interacting with other voices. But in this case, it's about the voice interacting with the physical and material world around us. Voice, then, is also seen as polyvalent and multi-sensorial, with authorship connected to visual simultaneity. Tito Mughopadhyay, in How Can I Speak If My Lips Don't Move, says, voices of colours and voices of shadows, voices of movement and their echoes, voices of silence spun near or far, through spaces and distance, soaking my ears. Voice in Mughopadhyay's work is connected to a spectrum of abstracts, ideas and concrete presences. There's a fluidity of form and ontological fluidity. Voice contains colours, shadows, movement, echoes, silence, encompassing a whole range of modalities. So to draw some of these nascent thoughts together, and I would stress they're just early thoughts, the first thing is then to stress that there are some allies with aspects of feminist theory and communication rights work in Memoirs by Autistic People. In some ways they are about having a voice, expressing an inner voice, and there's certainly many moments in which we can look at the ways in which these have expressed various different intersectional inequalities. But they also suggest then, in the way in which voices are differently experienced and expressed and processed, that there is a need within feminist theory, methods and praxis for what we might call multi-sense-led methods. That there needs to be more attention to that which is polyvalent, relational, material, and goes beyond the human-centric. And from this then, we might also suggest that there needs to be a rethinking of aspects of feminist ontology and knowledge-making, including then the extractive and individualistic inheritances we find still within feminist theory and methods. Thank you very much for listening, and here are some of the references, and do email me if you would like to, and I hope that this generates some interesting feedback and discussion. Thank you.